Think your life is tough? You wouldn't last a single day in ancient Rome. Modern conveniences have made us soft, and what Romans endured daily would leave most of us begging for a time machine back to the 21st century. Let's start with food, because if you thought ancient Rome was all about decadent feasts and endless wine, you've been watching too many movies. Unless you were rich enough to recline on couches and be fed grapes by servants, your diet was shockingly basic and sometimes dangerous. The typical Roman citizen survived on a monotonous mix of grain, legumes, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Forget about pasta and pizza. Those weren't even invented yet. The staple food for the average Roman? Pulse, a bland porridge made from spelt or barley. It was the oatmeal of the ancient world. Except imagine eating it 3 times a day, every day, for the rest of your life. They'd toss in onions, lentils, or chickpeas when they had them. But that didn't make it any more appetizing. Add in the fact that most ingredients were stored in unsanitary conditions, and you've got yourself a bowl full of bacteria with a side of indigestion. Meat? Rare and expensive. Fish was more common, especially salted fish imported from distant provinces, but it was often past its prime by the time it hit Roman plates, and fermented fish sauce, called garum, was slathered on everything. Think of it as Roman ketchup, except it smelled like someone left anchovies in the sun for a week. It was so pungent that even some Romans found it offensive, but it was cheaper than salt and masked the flavor of spoiled food. Bread was everywhere, but it wasn't the fluffy white stuff we eat today. Roman bread was dense, gritty, and often full of impurities. Their mills used stone grinding techniques that left fine bits of rock in the flour. Over time, this literally ground down people's teeth. Archaeologists have found Roman skulls with molars worn nearly flat. Now imagine trying to enjoy this meal with no utensils. Most Romans ate with their hands, and they didn't have napkins. They used bread crusts to wipe their fingers or just lick them clean. Sanitary? Not even close. And what did they wash all this down with? Wine, diluted, sour wine. Water wasn't always safe to drink, especially in crowded cities. Rome had aqueducts, but open-air lead pipes and cisterns often meant contamination. So they drank watered-down wine, not because they were fancy, but because it was safer than water. After that fine dining experience, let's talk toilets. In ancient Rome, public latrines were the norm for most people. Picture a row of stone benches with holes. No privacy, no partitions. You sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers doing their business. Underneath, a constant stream of water flushed waste away, but it wasn't always effective. And the smell? Imagine a sewer with no lid in the summer sun. Toilet paper didn't exist. Instead, Romans used a sponge on a stick, called a tersorium. It was shared, yes, shared, between users and cleaned by rinsing it in vinegar or salt water. If that doesn't send a chill down your spine, nothing will. Baths might sound like a reprieve, but even those had their downsides. The famous Roman baths were communal. Hundreds of people used the same pools, sweating, chatting, and rinsing off in tepid water. Bathers moved from warm to hot to cold rooms, but the water wasn't always changed. Skin diseases and infections spread like wildfire. And while Romans were obsessed with appearances and hygiene in theory, the reality was often a breeding ground for bacteria. If you were a woman, the experience came with extra challenges. Bathhouses had separate hours for men and women, but the spaces were often reused, rarely cleaned, and still crawling with germs. Privacy was limited, and safety wasn't guaranteed. Let's not forget the labor. Most Romans weren't lounging in togas. They were working themselves to the bone. The average laborer worked from sunrise to sunset, whether on farms, in workshops, or on construction sites. Tools were primitive, safety was non-existent, and injuries were common. If you got hurt, you either toughed it out or died. There were no sick days in Rome, and don't even think about calling in sick. Medicine was a gamble at best. Roman doctors followed the teachings of Galen, who believed the body was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments involved balancing these humors, which meant bloodletting, purging, or applying leeches. If you had a fever, you'd likely be drained of blood until you fainted. If that didn't kill you, the infection probably would. Let's say you survived disease. bad food, and public toilets. You'd still have to deal with Roman law, and that's a horror story on its own. Punishments were brutal. Theft could earn you a beating or forced labor. If you were a slave, consequences were even worse. Slaves were property, and owners could do almost anything to them without repercussions. Even minor crimes could lead to life-changing punishments. Justice wasn't about fairness, it was about maintaining order. And speaking of slaves, ancient Rome was built on their backs. Up to 40% of the population in some areas were enslaved. They worked in mines, on farms, in kitchens, and even as gladiators. Their lives were expendable. Rebellion meant torture, crucifixion, or being thrown to wild animals in public arenas. The psychological weight of knowing your life held no legal value was a burden no modern mind could fully comprehend. Entertainment wasn't exactly wholesome. Gladiator games were bloodbaths. Crowds cheered as men, and sometimes women, fought to the death. Wild animals were imported just to rip people apart for sport. Executions were public and theatrical. The Colosseum wasn't just a sports arena. It was a stage for mass killing. Even Roman housing was a nightmare. If you were poor, you lived in cramped, multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. These were made of wood and often poorly built. Fires were common, and when they happened, there were no firefighters. People jumped out of windows to escape. If you lived on the upper floors, you likely had no access to running water or toilets. Trash was dumped in the streets. Human waste too. The stench of Rome was infamous. Add in crowds, noise, and the ever-present threat of disease, and you've got a city that feels more like a death trap than a marvel. Rats were everywhere, contributing to the spread of illnesses. The air was thick with smoke, rot, and despair. And what about education? Most Romans were illiterate. Schooling was reserved for the wealthy. Children of poor families worked from a young age. Girls rarely received formal education at all. Life for women, controlled, limited, and full of danger, especially during childbirth, which often ended in death. Let's talk about Roman soldiers. If you were a citizen, you could be drafted. Life in the legions was harsh. Long marches, brutal training, and constant warfare. Desertion was punishable by death. And if your unit failed in battle, you could be subject to decimation, where 1 in every 10 men was killed by their comrades as punishment. Soldiers endured extreme weather, slept on the ground, and often faced enemies with superior numbers. Still think you'd survive 24 hours in ancient Rome? Unless you were rich, male, and born into the right family, your chances were slim. Between the disease, filth, brutal labor, and violent justice, Rome might have built an empire, but it wasn't built for comfort or mercy.